Hello and welcome to another episode of Set Musings. I bet you thought I missed this album. Well, I sort of did, which is rather unfortunate. So as I've been going through this year, these are going out in 2023, I've got a little bit fixated on 93 and 83, and there's a period where I sort of lost focus on what was going on in 73, but luckily I spotted it before we moved out of March. So today I want to talk about The Dark Side of the Moon, muse over it. This didn't have any great single success in the UK. It's different in the US, and I just want to talk a little bit about that and reflect on it. So this is more, I suppose this episode is going to be more a reflection on the band generally around that period and later in their career, rather than systematically going through the single success in the chart, because there was none in the UK for this, and we'll talk about what was going on, whether or not the band were or weren't releasing singles and things like that. So yeah, Dark Side of the Moon, 8th studio album by Pink Floyd, released on the 1st of March 1973 in the US. It was actually released on the 16th of March in the UK. So this video is being recorded on the 21st of March. So a Tuesday, so the previous week. This went out from that in 1973. So 50 years old this is now. And let's just take a little bit of time to reflect on generally what was getting released around that time. So you can see previous month we've got Tyranny and Mutation by Blue Oyster Cult, first Camel album. There's Dark Side of the Moon. We've got For Your Pleasure by Roxy Music, which was their second album. Lark's Tongue in Aspic. Houses Are Holy. Birds of Fire by Mahavishnu Orchestra. I always have problems with that. There's Billion Dollar Babies. And so on. Going into April, there was those two Beatles compilations with that famous piece of artwork there. I remember seeing that album a lot over the years. And then in April we've got Catch a Fire by Bob Marley. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff going on around that period album-wise in 1973. Back to the album. So looking at their discography as relates to their studio album, and at the end of this episode I'm going to revisit some of this sort of placement on the timeline. So here we are, Dark Side of the Moon 73. So you can see prior to that there's quite a number of albums. I'm also going to wait to the end to just reflect on my own exposure to the band and this album. And I suppose really at this point, if you were to ask any, non-fans of the band or people that maybe had a passing knowledge of Pink Floyd, my suspicions are it would be from Dark Side of the Moon through really to The Wall, where people would have are sort of most aware of that period of albums, if you like. I think the other thing that I certainly remember, and I've reflected on this lots of times with lots of different bands, was that phenomenon in the UK where you'd be walking past, say, a Woolworths or one of the other big stores, which at the time one was still going, but also in stocked vinyl is the displays, and certain album covers would stand out, and you just remember them. And things I remember are the cover to Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, The Wall, and then other things like I always remember the weird metal cover and the one with the cow on it, Atom Heart Mother, as well. So that was the other thing. Track listing, 10 tracks, clocking in at 42 minutes 50. That's the personnel. You can see the additional musicians here. There's that saxophone on the album. Those soaring vocals on The Great Gig in the Sky. Number of backing vocalists. Alan Parsons was the engineer. So chart-wise, we're going to talk about this. So it got to number 2 in the UK. And my little bit of exploration of the UK charts, because we can only really look at that from the perspective of the album. No, as far as I know, and as far as the charts tell me, no singles from this album ever touched the UK charts. But the album was kept off the number 1 spot, and it's super annoying what it was keeping it off. And I've, again, in previous episodes, I've talked a lot about a certain type of album that was in the UK charts at the time. They resolved that, thankfully, but yeah, they were all over the charts. In terms of certifications, again, obviously different countries certify in different ways in terms of the thresholds, but you can see, judging by the table there, pretty successful album, I would say. And again, you have to be careful with the tables here, because I don't know how regularly they are updated, so this could be fairly out of date. When was that retrieved? 2021, so we're 1.5 years out of date when this video goes out. 15 times platinum. 4.5 million in certified unit sales. Now I think in the UK, and again, I'm doing this off the top of my head, with album sales, wasn't that always based on the value sold? And with singles, it's based on the volume. I think that's right. Anyway. So, moving on to Album of the Year. And I've ordered this by popularity based on their scoring system. Yeah, well, I don't think there's any surprise here. Those 4 albums I cited previously in the list are definitely, jockeying for position. And, I wasn't surprised that this has come out top. But it's got here, that if you've used Album of the Year, you'll know they also have this system where they do mark what they consider to be, was it like essential albums or albums that you should definitely listen to. And we have 5 of their albums here, including Metal. This has one of these days on it, I believe. I should take a look actually, because I'm trying to remember which album has tracks like Echoes on it as well. So, official UK charts. So the UK has, in terms of singles, the band's had one number one, and we will talk about that. It wasn't obviously off of this album because the singles didn't chart. 2 UK top 10s, 7 top 40s, 11 in the top 75, 5 weeks at number one. And again, remember, this is in total across all their singles they released and have charted in the UK charts. Now, what's interesting is when we get on to albums. So quite a big difference there. 6 UK number ones, 18 top 10s, 27 top 40s, 28 top 75s, 11 weeks at number one, 132 weeks at number 10, 573 weeks in the top 40 and 981. Now remember, this is their albums as a total, and we'll get on to the individual stats in a moment. So you can see, I'm going to just look through their albums first, just because the stats are better. And their first number one in terms of albums was Atom Heart Mother. Dark Side of the Moon, as I said, got to number 2. It was on the charts for 500, or it's been on the charts for 557 weeks. And we'll have a look at that in a moment as we drill down. Wish You Were Here, number 1. Animals, number 2. The Wall, number 3. So this is a pretty good run. Also, just remember that this album listing is mixed in with compilations. So, for instance, A Nice Pair. So it's a shame we can't delimit this and just see that run through here. Relics was also a compilation album. So if you try and ignore those, you can see, yeah, their album chart success is pretty enviable, I would say. Now, while I'm in here, so I don't jump back again, let's just expand out Dark Side. So, straight in the charts, 31st of March 73 was released on, what date did I say? The first there, but it was actually the 16th in the UK. So yeah, straight into number 2, that goes out the charts, pops back in again, and then this is its, you know, like a mega run of 135 weeks. Now, it's interesting to look at this because, again, I'm not sure at this point in the UK chart history, you know, were they counting up to the top 100 or 75? When you always watched or listened to radio stations in the UK, they were always obsessed by the top 40. That was their sort of cut-off point. But you can see we've got stuff here, so it's quite possible that at this point, judging by the fact that's where it's getting, maybe it was a top 75 chart overall. And then we've got other runs you can see over the years. And no doubt these revolve around particular events of the band or certain promotions maybe, where the track might appear in an advert or, you know, a certain track, or just be, you know, something going on at that time that brings the band back into the public psyche. I'm also curious, as I get more up to date, there was this phenomenon when we got into the world of, or the era of streaming, and streaming was being counted. Suddenly the top 40 albums charts got just swamped with classic albums. When I was starting to look through, as to whether I should cover later years in these episodes, years closer to 2023, when I wasn't locking into like 10-year anniversaries of albums, so things like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40, 50, and just looking for a sweet spot. I did notice that in the last few years, albums like some Fleetwood Mac albums seem to be continually in the top 10 week after week after week, and obviously that's an effect of streaming being counted and downloads and stuff like that. So I'm not necessarily seeing that here, or not as much as I thought. So I did want to just look at the singles. You can see there's a sort of singles hole, which is interesting, in the UK at least. As I mentioned at the start, they were having single success in the US, and we'll look at that. But you can see here, Arnold Lane, See Emily Play, and then, Another Brick in the Wall. And this was huge at the time. I was actually still at school at this point, and I remember it caused quite a bit of a stir at the time. There's a bit of a pushback against the education system. Even though in the context of the album and the film, if you've seen the film, the time period against which this applies, I'm not sure whether it's supposed to be a little bit earlier than when I went to school, but certainly the sentiment at the time was the same. And we already saw previously that the contrast with the album side of things. So really big. Clearly not a singles band, except initially way back in the 60s, and then like here, suddenly they have this number one single. So, just to see what kept Dark Side of the Moon from getting to number one, it was 20 Flashback Greatest of the 60s by K-Tel. And it just so happened that it had its chart run. Is that roughly 10 weeks? So 1, 2, 3, 4... 11-week run on the charts at the same time as Dark Side of the Moon. Didn't manage to keep Billion Dollar Babies off the number one spot. And often, at that point in time, that might be all it would need to keep it off the top spot. There was a 2-week run, and I wonder where did Tank get to? No, 4 to Tanks didn't. Billion Dollar Babies had already got in and out. So I'm not sure what would have got to number one at that point. Well, in fact, I know I can find out, because if I just do this, let's see what happened the following week. So we know that, it was starting to bounce out by then. Oh, look. K-Tel and Arcade, you have a lot to answer for. Thankfully, those sort of albums were removed from the charts. Oh, Houses of the Holy, of course. So there's a holy combination of Houses of the Holy and an unholy combination of these flashbacks and fantastic hits. Oh, wow. They were certainly, heavy competitive chart at that time. Faces Ooh La La, For Your Pleasure by Roxy Music. That's the Clockwork Orange soundtrack. Okay, so let's just reflect a little bit on, their singles. And so what we've got to try and do here is remember where this column is. So this is the UK column. So you can see here these are non-album singles. Piper at the Gates of Dawn, these non-album singles. So all the way through here until we get to Another Brick in the Wall, it's not even denting the UK charts at all, even though they are releasing singles. So there's actually 4 singles, according to this, that were released off the album. 2 in 73, 2 in 74. Money and Any Colour You Like. And then Us and Them and Time. Now, if I do go to here, you can see across the ocean, this was actually their first hit in the US, reaching number 10 in Cashbox magazine and number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100. Look at Time. Even though there was no chart success in the UK, it still managed to go silver actually at that point. So we've got Money and Time released in the US. Of course, the other thing, it's difficult to tell with this, and I didn't really go down that deep because I've always thought of Pink Floyd as an album band and never really paid a lot of attention to their singles, apart from the fact that this was huge for them. Which one of these were released in which territory? Now, if you do look down here, you can see there were a few other territories where it did, got in the charts, but not in the UK. So is this just the fact that it's... Oh, yeah, so they're actually listing B-sides. Yeah, sorry. So I keep forgetting that. These are... Is that a separate one? Yeah, it's a bit confusing there, actually. Some are B-sides, some are not. So, yeah, sorry about that. It is very confusing as to which is which here. And the other thing is, if like me, you've ever gone through a period of collecting singles for bands, it's amazing what you can stumble across, where the single was sort of released in a certain territory and nowhere else. I did that with a lot of Judas Priest releases from the 70s into the 80s. I started collecting some of their singles, and it was fascinating the amount of different variations you could come across of a single, and some tracks like ending up on B-sides or being released as singles in other territories as well. But clearly, not pick of the pops as far as the singles are concerned in the UK. Now, if we look at their studio albums, as we've seen already, slightly different story there. Now, how have they organised this? Because, so in the UK, The Wall, when I said Another Brick in the Wall, the single got to number 1. The album got to number 3 in the UK charts. So, was it Wish You Were Here was number 1? Atom Heart Mother. Animals 2, The Wall 3, Final Cut actually got to number 1. Momentary Lapse of Region, Division Bell, number 1. Look at that. Wow. I think it's about time I did another little listen through of their album output. Actually, I haven't done it for a number of years. Now, we already had a look earlier on in this episode, in this video, as to what else was coming out around that time. But just to recap there, you can see there's How's the Holy by Led Zeppelin. I thought it would be interesting also to look at 1973 generally. Here's the best of albums of 73. As a contrast here, I'm using best ever instead of album of the year. And you can sort of get a feel for how their aggregate assessment is working. 73, so selling into England by the pound. So this is the whole of 73. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Band on the Run, Raw Power, Led Insane, Future Days by Can, Lynyrd Skynyrd, first album For Your Pleasure Rocks Your Music, Tubular Bells, Headhunters, and the list just goes on. Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. That was a bumper year. Lark's Tongues in Aspic, Catch a Fire, New York Dolls album, and yep, I could spend ages looking down that. I also wanted to look at the NME list, their polls for that year. So there we go. And it was interesting to note, 72 it was Rod Stewart, and then 74 was another Rod Stewart album. I really do enjoy actually early Rod Stewart around this period. If you haven't checked out Rod Stewart from that era, yeah, you should definitely check the albums out. It's funny when you look down here, they've got Best Dressed LP, Yes Songs, Disc Jockey John Peel, Most Overrated Single, Tie Yellow Ribbon, yeah. Golden Earring, Most Promising Act, Best TV Show, The Old Grey Whistle Test. I imagine that, yeah, won consistently. So they obviously liked Yes that year as well. So that was to remind me about just some musings about this period. So I don't have a lot of memory around listening to the album, particularly when it came out in 73. If you were to sort of ask me the first time I really got properly exposed to the band, or to such a degree that I went down a Pink Floyd rabbit hole, even though I'd heard tracks like Shine On You Crazy Diamond and various other tracks from various albums, it would definitely be The Wall. It's no surprise, I've said this on several occasions, the reason why the YouTube channel is called Flourishing Music 79, or previously Toxic Music 79, is because 1979 is my favourite year in music. And this, at a point, I was devouring the Friday Rock Show, and there was an episode where Tommy Vance interviewed now let me just get this right. So yeah, he interviewed just Roger Waters, in a hotel room, and they went through the album track by track. I'm not going to include the link. I'll try and actually remember to include the link in the episode. I wasn't going to do it originally because this episode obviously isn't about The Wall. But I think now I've mentioned it, I will include a link if I can find that interview. There is a Friday Rock Show wiki, so I'll include a link to that with the particular episode, and then you can do the rest if you're curious. But yeah, really interesting and revealing discussion between the two of them. And in the actual episode that was aired, they went through the whole album track by track. And so that was my sort of proper gateway into the band. Then what happened, which was rather amusing, is a few years later, a friend of mine invited me round one evening, and we listened to a couple of compilation albums by bands. One was Relics by Pink Floyd, and the other was a Deep Purple early album. And I remember listening to that stuff, just chatting about music generally and drinking whiskey. I think it's the only time I've drunk a fair amount of whiskey. I mean, I'm completely teetotal now and have been for decades, which was off the back of I had a particularly bad bout of, I think what in the North America is called mono, in the UK it's called glandular fever, and I was super sick with that, and as a result I gave up alcohol in the 80s actually, and I now literally can't stand the smell, which is funny considering my consumption back then. So yeah, so I just remember the vivid imagination of going out there and drinking whiskey, listening to Pink Floyd and Deep Purple. And really from that point, I sort of slowly worked my way through that, the albums that I'd really highlighted. So really Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals. Now the other interesting thing is in between this, in between me having really heavy listens to The Wall in 79 into 80 and then listening to early stuff, when I was in the sixth form in the really early 80s, so I stayed on at school for a year, I kept playing Animals on the stereo there. Someone had a tape of the whole album, so I got massively exposed to this album. Probably so The Wall first, then Animals, and then the other two, and Metal. And then sometime in the mid to late 80s, we used to hang out a lot at this place on a Friday. So we drive up to there from work, hang around, and at that point they had a CD jukebox, and it actually had Dark Side of the Moon on it. And a friend I worked with was just a real prog fanatic and would constantly go on about Genesis and Pink Floyd. And so when we went up there, he'd always be putting on certain key tracks from that album, so that whenever I think about Pink Floyd, I can't help thinking about this place. And I've mentioned it in other episodes. I have real strong emotional ties to this place. It's a wonderful, if you ever are in the UK or visiting the UK and you find yourself around this area in the country, which is close to Lingfield, so in sort of the Surrey-Sussex border, I suppose, around there. It's down quite a long road. I've not been down there for a long time, so I don't know what state the road is. I remember one of my friends damaging their car, actually going down there, causing problems with their suspension. I think it's improved a lot since then. But yeah, it's great. They do weekends. There's normally there used to be water skiing out on the lake as well. As you probably give away in the title, the Wire Mill. There used to be a mill here, and you can actually see the remnants. I think the mill wheel's still there, actually. We can't really see it very easily, but there's somewhere down here, there's like a, what would you call it, like a small sluice, like a dam, where the water was controlled. And yeah, awesome place. Spot of sunny socialising. So that's probably what I want to talk about today. I know for a bit of a side track there, but still related to Pink Floyd. Thanks once again for listening and watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next episode.